David, you first became the president of the Australia-China Business Council in November 2019. You accepted that role knowing the Chinese government was building concentration camps for Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang. Scholarly estimates put the number detained based on their Muslim faith at more than 1 million. The BBC has shown that rape and torture are systematic within these camps. The AP has shown the Chinese regime is suppressing the Uyghur birth rate with forced abortions and forced sterilizations. This all meets the definition of genocide under international law. So my question to you is simple. How, in good conscience, can you continue to advocate business with China while this terrible genocide takes place?
David Olsson.
Thanks, Drew. Well, look, it's really a very difficult question to be able to answer that clearly. You know, the issues that we're seeing in Xinjiang are shocking, and you know, the problem we have at the moment is we don't have journalists on the ground. We have very little direct information about what's happening there. Now, I think most of us would genuinely believe that there are serious issues that need to be addressed. Our government has looked at this. It's not used the same language of genocide that other governments have used around the world in recent times. The UK, Canada parliaments have recently passed specific legislation using that term genocide. The Australian government has decided not to use that language, but have condemned in very clear terms what's going on in those nations.
Do you believe it's genocide?
I haven't. Genocide is a technical term that needs to be defined under.
It is a technical term, but the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it's exactly the right description.
Right. It is a term that is clearly something that we need to be really concerned about in terms of what is actually going on there. What I'm more concerned about is the fact that we just need to verify the information first of all, and I don't believe that there's much that we need to prove, but we do need to get people in there. United Nations have said that they are in close discussions now with the Chinese government to allow free and unfettered access to the Xinjiang province to review that. I think that's a really helpful sign. In the meantime, I think the most important thing we can be doing is to continue to advocate the principles that we believe in around human rights.
I'm not sure if I'm clear on your answer to that. Vicky Xu, is it genocide in Xinjiang?
The US government, the government in the Netherlands and Canada have all recognized the Uyghur crisis to be genocide. Now, Australia is in the unfortunate company of Turkey. Australia and Turkey are the only two countries in the world that have had a vote to decide if this is genocide and decided no. And so my personal belief is Australia has decided not to call this genocide, not because the crimes are not severe enough, but because economic considerations. So I think the question really is, how much do we Australians want to stand up for our beliefs? How much do we want to stand up for our values? And at what cost? Because as some of the audience here would know that I have been enduring the smear campaign for a month. The Chinese state has called me a female demon for writing about forced labor in Xinjiang and generally in China. So for business, the problem is, right, the Chinese state is facilitating, arranging a forced labor scheme targeting Uyghurs. And as a result, businesses have been implicated, supply chains have been implicated. And when businesses are trying to move out of China or trying to steer clear of forced labor, when they make promises to the world, to their consumers that they will be ethical, they face backlash in China. So businesses, if they want to respect, if they want to adhere to international law, modern slavery law in their own countries, they could not operate in China. So that's the situation we're in now.
Just on the personal story you mentioned, what has happened to you over the last month or so?
I was lynched in the Chinese media, along with a lot of my peers who study Xinjiang.
Your name was like top trending on the Chinese version of Twitter for a while.
Yeah. So last year, a year ago, last March, And me and my colleagues at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and our colleagues from the Washington Post Beijing Bureau, we did a collaboration. We wrote about forced labor and went to a Nike factory and identified forced labor clues. And we wrote a report and named 83 brands that have been implicated with forced labor in their supply chains. And a year later, because there has been legislations, there has been companies pulling out of China. So now the Chinese government, in an attempt to rescue its reputation, to defend its actions regarding Xinjiang, has decided to go on the offensive, and they've done two things. The first is encouraging and partially facilitating popular protests in China to endorse Xinjiang cotton, which has now become a symbol of Uyghur forced labor. And two, a smear campaign targeting people like myself. My other colleagues who do work on Xinjiang have been accused of rape. And I have been called so many names. And last night when I was eating at a Chinese restaurant with a friend, I felt uneasy and I was being stared at. And it's a difficult time.
You're being followed here? Or monitored?
In the past 8 months, people close to me who still live in China have been targeted by Chinese intelligence operatives. People close to me have been interrogated repeatedly, detained. They're paying a price for me to tell the truth here.
Okay. So if the truth is that it's genocide, James Paterson, why don't we call it that?
Well, Hamish, I was banned from visiting China in part because I've been outspoken about these issues.
So do you call it genocide?
I think it's very hard to look at Vicky's research and the research for former colleagues at ASPI or Human Rights Watch or any of these other groups that have done it and conclude anything else. The reason why the Australian government hasn't declared it is not because of some judgment about trade or economics. It's because the Australian government has a long-standing policy that a genocide declaration is a legal declaration and a court should do that, not governments and not politicians. But I'm happy to say it sure looks like it to me.
So why is it hard for our foreign minister to say that, though?
Well, to be fair, our foreign minister's been one of the most outspoken foreign ministers internationally on these issues, and she's called for the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to have access to Xinjiang so that they can collect evidence to help make this determination. And the Chinese government's unwillingness to allow them in speaks volumes, as does, frankly, the campaign of harassment they've launched against Vicky and her colleagues internationally. Why on earth would you do that if you didn't have something to hide?
David Olsson, how do you respond to this?
Well, I think it's shocking in terms of what's happened to Vicky and her colleagues. That it's disgraceful. One of the problems we've got is I think China is undertaking a propaganda campaign around the world that's completely misjudged global sentiment around these issues. The exercise the other day with the Chinese ambassador, who's a very bright chap, and
You're referring to a press conference that was held where they zoomed in people from Xinjiang.
That's right. He was clearly on instructions to represent the Chinese case for that, but it completely misread the mood of the Australian public and the broader community. And I think it's done nothing but further polarise views around the issue. And unfortunately, that's made it very hard to have a sensible conversation about this. And I think the issue is fairly clear-cut as to how we need to act.